The dust hung thick over the small frontier yard where men gathered not for mercy but for bargains, and Daniel Crow stood there with calloused hands and an empty future, his boots worn thin. His ranch sinking under debt like a wounded horse in deep mud. He hadn't come to buy a soul, he told himself that over and over, but loneliness and desperation make a man bend truths until they break. The auctioneer's voice cut through the heat, listing laborers, broken men, and finally her. Too wild for any man, they said, laughing, thrown off 3 ranches. Can't be tamed. She stood alone, chin lifted, eyes sharp like a storm over open land, wrists scarred from rope burns not of weakness but resistance. She wasn't afraid, she was furious. Daniel didn't see madness in her. He saw fire, the kind that refuses to die even when the world tries to stomp it out. When no one bid, he raised his hand with the last of his money. Not knowing why, only knowing something in his chest tightened like fate had just looped a rope around both their lives. Her name was Clara Vale, and she didn't thank him. She didn't speak at all on the ride to his ranch, sitting tall in the saddle as if she'd been born there, not riding behind like the others forced into silence. Daniel noticed how her hands moved with the reins, how the horse responded not to force but trust. When they arrived, his ranch looked like his soul, fences broken, barn leaning, land tired and aching. "You don't own me," she finally said, voice calm but edged like steel. Daniel nodded. "Never wanted to," he replied. That was the first crack in the wall between them. Over days, she worked harder than any hand he'd ever known, riding at dawn, breaking horses no one else dared touch, mending fences with quiet skill. The ranch began to breathe again, and Daniel couldn't understand how someone labeled too wild could be exactly what broken land needed. At night, he watched her stare at the stars like she was remembering something stolen from her, something big and free. The town whispered, men sneered. Careful, they warned him. Wild things destroy what they touch, but Daniel had lived long enough to know it was the world that did the destroying. One evening, when a stallion threw him hard and pain lit his spine like fire, it was Clara who rode out alone, who calmed the beast with a whisper and brought Daniel home. As she helped him inside, their eyes met, not with desire but recognition. 2 broken things realizing they might fit together not to cage one another but to survive. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the woman the world had tried to tame was born not to kneel behind him, but to ride beside him. The truth came riding in with the wind one brutal afternoon when strangers arrived on polished horses. That didn't belong to men who worked for a living. They carried papers, old brands, and older lies, claiming Daniel's land under debts forged long before his father died. Clara read the signs before Daniel did, the way these men looked at the hills, the water, the sky. They weren't here for money. They were here for ownership. That night, Clara finally spoke of her past, not as confession but as revelation. She wasn't born wild, she was raised free. Her mother had been a legendary rider, her father a man who believed land and horses answered only to respect. When they died, Clara was passed from ranch to ranch, punished for refusing obedience without dignity, branded too wild because she would not break herself for cruel men. "They don't fear wild women," she said quietly. "They fear women who remember who they are." When the claim turned violent, it was Daniel who led, it was Clara. She rode through the night, rallied old hands who owed her parents their lives, men who remembered her as a child racing the wind across open plains. The final stand wasn't loud, it was unbreakable. Truth surfaced, the land papers were false. The ranch was Daniel's by right. When the dust settled, Clara stood beside him, not owned, not rescued, not tamed, equal. The ranch didn't just survive, it thrived. Horses ran strong, grass returned, and love grew not from possession but from choice. Daniel never asked her to stay, she did anyway. Years later, travelers would whisper of a ranch where a man and woman rode side by side, where wildness wasn't punished but honored, where broken things found home. And Daniel would smile, knowing the greatest gift he ever received wasn't something he bought, but someone the world tried and failed to cage. Time did not tame Clara Vale, it sharpened her. Seasons rolled across the Crow Ranch like long breaths, and with every sunrise she rode out beside Daniel, not behind. Her silhouette cutting the horizon as if she belonged to it more than the land itself. People came from miles away to see the woman once labeled too wild, now spoken of with something closer to reverence. She trained horses others failed with, settled disputes without raising her voice, and turned a struggling spread into a place of quiet authority. Daniel watched her sometimes when she didn't know, how she laughed with the wind, how she listened to the ground like it whispered secrets, and he realized something that frightened him more than debt or loss ever had. He could lose the land and survive. but losing her would hollow him beyond repair. Yet love, like wild horses, cannot be forced, and so he held his silence, choosing respect over fear. Trouble returned the way it always does, slow, smiling, and armed with entitlement. A powerful cattle syndicate set its sights on the valley, offering money Daniel refused and threats he ignored. They underestimated Clara. When fences were cut and water poisoned, it was she who traced the signs, who rode through the night to warn neighboring ranches, who stood before armed men with a calm that unsettled them more than anger ever could. "This land doesn't belong to you," she told them, "and it never will." Her words carried weight not because she shouted but because she knew exactly who she was. When violence finally broke loose, the valley stood together, and the syndicate retreated under the force of unity Clara had quietly built. That night, as stars burned bright above the hills, Daniel finally spoke the truth he'd carried like a brand on his heart. Not asking, not claiming, only offering. Clara listened, eyes soft, then smiled the smile of a woman who had already chosen. "I was never meant to be owned," she said. "But I was always meant to ride with you." They did not marry in a church or before witnesses hungry for spectacle. They made their vow on horseback at dawn, reins loose side by side, equal in every way that mattered. The ranch became a legend not of romance alone but of balance. A place where strength and gentleness shared the same saddle. Children later grew up hearing the story wrong, of course. They said Daniel saved a wild woman, that he bought her freedom. But the truth lived quieter and stronger. A struggling rancher and a woman the world refused to understand found each other not through ownership, but through choice, respect, and shared fire. And somewhere in the open land where hooves still thunder and freedom still breathes, their story rides on.